Right.
Okay, good evening to everyone. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Kahan for giving me this gewaldige opportunity of being able to address the topic of Hilchas Shabbos and Refuah. And yes, we're competing tonight with the game, but nevertheless, we still have to, the Torah still has to continue. And regardless of the outcome of the game, we're all going to be winners. So that's guaranteed. Whoever learns Torah is always a winner. So tonight, we're going to continue the discussion that we started last time in regards to different inyonim that are negeya to doctors when it comes to refuah on Shabbos. Now, I wanted to make a few comments. I see that we have perhaps some Hatzalah members as well attending tonight. And last time, we definitely had Hatzalah members, and some of them even came up to me and spoke to me about the different things that were discussed in the Shir. Now, I explained it to them, and I wanted to make it very clear to everyone that these halachas that we're discussing, and especially what we spoke about last time, is more negeya to doctors. And I would like to explain the difference between doctors and Hatzalah members. Hatzalah members are called when there's an emergency. And when there's an emergency, you don't think, you do, and then you ask questions. That's what the halacha says. The Shulchan Aruch says, and the Makor Yerushalmi, Hashoyel hareze shoifech domim, Hamnishal hareze meguna, which means that someone that has a question about saving a life, or maybe saving a life, even a safek pikuach nefesh, and before he does so, he goes and asks a shaila, he's a shoifech domim, because first you do. If let's say it turns out that he made a mistake, then there's no einish on that, because he did it b'rshus, and therefore the halacha is that first you do and then you ask. And so more so, we see that a rov that someone comes to ask him such a shaila, hamishal hareza meguna, because it's the rov's job to constantly remind people that whenever there's a question, you just do and then you ask. So a Hatzalah member, most of the questions, most of the issues is when there's an emergency. So if there's an emergency, you just do. Doctors, generally speaking, when they go to a hospital they have their shifts. In a hospital, there's always someone on call. So there's always a doctor there. So it's not like, it's a matzav of pikuach nefesh be'etzem. Avada, it could happen that they're in the hospital and there's a cold that goes out, cold blue or whatever they call it here in England, and then avada, everyone runs. But we're talking about general. The point of this shiurim, I think that's what I understood from Dr. Kayan, was that there are many young doctors who are establishing their career. They're starting out and they want to set it up in the right way. How should they do it? How should they conduct themselves? And this is something in a bechina of what we find. Shlomo HaMelech says, "Chanoich lenar al pi darkei gam ki yaskin lo yosem mimenu," which means that if someone is already older and now for him to start changing things, it's not so simple, because people are already used to different things and different methods and different ways. So not always is it practical. But someone that's just about to start out and they start in a hospital, they have a job, they have a shift. So they want to set it up in such a way that it should be done in the proper way. And that is, I think, unless Alicia is going to correct me, but that is mainly the purpose of this shiurim, to see how should a doctor conduct themselves. And that's why last time we had a very productive discussion, Benegeya, how to get to hospital, how to come home from hospital. These are questions that come up on a weekly basis, and it's something that they want to set up properly. Now, I want to bring out an akuda, Benegeya, the inyan of setting up things properly. There is a very interesting thing that we find in the poskim, benogeya, the anusim of Sfard. There are many seifim in Shulchan Aruch, in Yeridea, in Even HaEzer, where the Shulchan Aruch addresses the question about the anusim. Now, the question of anusim, some may or may not know, is not something that originated by the story of the expulsion of Spain. The expulsion of Spain happened in 1492, and the Beis Yosef, the Rabbi Yosef Karo, was 4 years old when they were expelled from Spain. So he could have written about it based on what happened in Spain. But the fact is that the first one to speak about it was the Rivosh. The Rivosh, as we may or may not know, he lived in Spain. He was the chief Rav of Spain. And in 1391, that's 100 years before the expulsion of Spain, there was major nisyones benegeya, the Indian of the Goyim, and them forcing them to accept Nazarus. And there are many stories and many shilas that came up and evolved around that period of time. That period of time was considered a very dark period because many Yidden were killed, and many Yidden, including Gedolei Yisrael, which we're not going to mention, but there's a lot of evidence that shows that many Gedolei Yisrael accepted Nazarus Lefonim, and they left the country and they went to North Africa, where they were able to practice their religion openly. And that period was a very dark period for the Jews of Spain. And the Rivosh has Shailas Benegeya, people that went through that period who accepted upon themselves the Nazarus Leponim, and then they left, whether they have a din of a mummer or not. Now, the Shulchan Aruch, you can look it up in Siman Kuf Yutes, says that anyone that was forced and basically they accepted Leponim, it looked like they accepted Nazarus. If it was done for the reason that they couldn't just leave and they had to stay behind, then the Shulchan Aruch says that their wine is kosher, their shechita is kosher, etc. In other words, anusim do not have a din of mumrim because they were forced. There is a tshuva in the Tashbetz. Now, the Tashbetz was a later generation from the Rivosh. He is the one who took over the Rivosh, and they had many arguments. But the Tashbetz has many tshuvas where he discusses at length people that had a choice to leave if they would have wanted, but they didn't leave because of their money and because of all their assets were tied up in Spain. So the question is, do they have a din of anusim or not? So the Tashbetz makes certain nafkaminas, and there are steers, but this is not what the topic of our discussion. But we see that this was something that the Gedola Poskim, Rishonim, Achroinim, they dealt with these type of things in that time. Now, as I said, if you look in the Shulchan Aruch and Hilchas Yeridea by Hilchas Choshud, as I said in Siman Kuf Yutes, and if you look in Even HaEzer, in the Ramah, speaks about the Kiddushin, right? Because there were many of these Anusim that they were Eidos. They were the only witnesses that witness Kiddushin. So the question is whether the Kiddushin is Chal or not. And you have other places, you see that the Shulchan Aruch clearly says that these Yidden have a Cheskes Kashrus, no problem. Now, fast forward less than 100 years later, that was, like as I said, in the 14th century, 1391, and then you have the Shulchan Aruch brings it down. The Mechaber, the Beis Yosef, quotes the Rivosh. Then in the 1500s, you have tshuvas from the Marshdam. So the Marshdam was also one of the Gedolim of Sfard, and he has a whole shaila about kiddushin of someone that the Edom were from these, as we would call them, the Anusim, and he says it's possible, there's no kiddushin, etc., etc. And there's other marmakoimus as well, where we see later achroinim in later generations, basically considered the anusim as psulim. So the question is, what's going on here? If we have a Shulchan Aruch that clearly says that anusim are considered kosher yidden and yenom is yain kosher, etc., how could the later poskim come out and say that their kedushin is not kedushin and literally strip them of everything that's Jewish? So the simple answer is because it all depends in which generation we're talking about. The first generation were taka anusim, and they had problems. And even if, let's say, the oinus was momon, afal piken, we find justification that they knew that they have to get out of there as soon as possible, but they had some hardships and they had to sort out their issues and their matters before they were able to do so. And because of that, if someone is in such a situation, he's an oinus rachmana patre, and you can't consider him as apostle. However, once 100 years passed and more, and many Yidden had opportunities to go, whether it was to Amsterdam or to other places where Yidden left and finally were able to practice their religion freely. So all of a sudden, what's your excuse? In other words, you cannot take a b'diavad and turn it into lekatchila. And if you take a b'diavad and you turn it into lekatchila, that's when the problem starts. And this can also be a problem in other aspects of life. There's a very, very interesting phenomenon which in America was very, very, very rampant. And that is that you had Rabbonim who were Orthodox and they kept, Torah mitzvahs, but they wanted to become Rabbonim in conservative kehillas. So in England, conservative is not such a so shchiach. So a conservative is basically, some say they're almost like reform. They're not showing Torah mitzvahs properly. They drive on Shabbos and they don't keep Torah mitzvahs properly, and they don't feel that they should be doing what the reform are doing, because the reform are goyim gemurim. Literally, they accept anyone and they have goyim davening in their shuls. So the conservative is a movement that was a big movement, and actually the head of the conservative, the founder of the conservative, was a Jew by the name, I think his name was Schechter, Solomon Schechter from London actually, and he created that movement. Now the problem is that in the shul they have mics, they have other things. So the Rav would keep Torah mitzvahs, but he would be a Rav by the conservative. So this was a very big question, whether is that allowed or not. So there are many different views and many different opinions about this. But just by the way, as a side thing, someone told me that here in Hendon, there used to be the Reform Synagogue on Dainsgrove, and the Reform only keep Rosh Hashanah one day. So on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, the rabbi would come to Hendon Adas and daven there, because there was no minyan in his shul. So he came there, and on a year when the first day was Shabbos, that was the only time they heard Tkiyah Shofar, because when it comes to Shabbos, they have a problem, because they only keep one day, and for them to blow Shofar on Shabbos, they say we can't be more frum than the Orthodox, so they just don't blow Shofar. But anyway, so this rabbi would come to Orthodox shul to daven there the second day of Rosh Hashanah. So you have this phenomenon. Is it a problem for an Orthodox person, rabbi, to be the rabbi in a conservative shul? So many felt that the metzias is that if a person is constantly giving psokim based on a kuladig away, and in this case the conservative, they don't keep proper Torah mitzvahs, sooner or later, or sooner rather than later, it will rub off on the rabbi himself, and that's a fact. I remember in Toronto, there was a young fellow who grew up in a frum home. He went to a frum cheder, and he became a rabbi by the conservatives. And it didn't take long, and he behaved like them, and he did everything like they do. So you see from here that there is this problem that if it's very hard for a person to constantly, if in practice they lower their standard, that they should keep it when they don't have that circumstance, which is why I will explain certain things that I feel that doctors should behave in a certain way, that they shouldn't feel that they're doing something wrong all the time. Because if a person feels that they're doing something wrong all the time, then first of all, it ruins the whole, inside of a person, to feel that way. And it can have an effect on a person in a very strong way. And I'll give you an example. One of the questions that a doctor asked, he sent it to Alicia, who forwarded it to me, was as follows, that in a certain way, if we tell the doctors that you have to do certain things with a shinui and do it, with a goy, and not always is it possible, sooner or later they may get frustrated, they may start resenting it. So in other words, we want to try to create some kind of a mahalach of how to do things, even if, let's say, it's not something that we would do otherwise, which means if it wouldn't be for the tzorech of a doctor. But in this case, we would say that the doctor should do it without having to feel guilt. Avada, it's only, when he goes to hospital, etc. But we will try to explain and see where exactly it can play itself out. So let's take, for example, so last time we spoke about the doctor going to hospital. So the doctor's in hospital, he went by taxi and it's all arranged. Now he comes in. So usually the front door is not a problem, even if it's an automated door, because, a hospital is, people come and go. So that shouldn't be a problem. But the question is, when you go from ward to ward or from floor to floor or from, today, you constantly have to sort of let yourself in through electronic doors, etc. So let's try to understand what exactly is the status of electronic doors and what is allowed and what is not allowed. So avada and avada, if let's say a person is going to hospital and going to visit someone and they're not a doctor, just a regular person, even if they have a loved one there, close relatives. So in such a case, we would say that the person should either wait for a guy to come, or you can even ask a guy to open the door, because this is also a whole discussion. But the point is that opening the door, when you're knocking on the door and the guy opens it, that's considered, according to many poskim, remez. Why? Because be'etzem, remez, as we know, is not allowed when you're doing a pa'ula of Maisa Shabbos, which means if, let's say, you need a light open, and by light you have a heter of ner la'echad, ner la'meya. But let's say in a case where the goy has no benefit from it. So even if, let's say, you say it beremez, you still have a problem being nehana from the light, because at the end of the day, there's something called Maisa Shabbos, which means that anything that was done be'isser on Shabbos for a yid is not allowed. You're not allowed to have anoah until Motzei Shabbos v'chdei sheyasu. So if that's the case, remez doesn't help. Where does remez help? Remez only helps where you're eliminating something. When you don't have hanoah from the etzem Maisa, let's say, for example, you want the light to be turned off. You don't need the light anymore. So then we find that you tell the goy, I don't need this light anymore. And if the goy turns it off, he's eliminating. You're not nehana from the melacha, you're only nehana from the poel yoitze. So that's, their remez would be allowed. Or if, let's say, a person has, the stove is open, the hob, and it's getting hot. So you tell the goy, I no longer need this fire. So if the goy understands, that means that he turns it off. So you're not nehana from the actual meleches hakibui. You have hanoah from the fact that the fire is off. So there we find the inyan of remez. We find the same thing by a letter. Igeres, opening a letter, is something which is osir on Shabbos because of Korea. But if, let's say, you meramas to the goy that maybe there's something important in this letter, and the guy opens it up. So you're not nehana from the malacha that he's doing. You're nehana from the fact that you can access the letter that's inside. So this is something that we find in the poskim. So l'chayra, according to this whole mahalach, opening a door to go in would l'chayra be a problem, because there you're not eliminating, you are nehana from the fact that now you can go into the next ward because of the goy. But the poskim say that since the malacha and the hana are not in the same thing, the malacha is the actual opening the door, whatever malacha that is. We'll see soon. The Raisa, the Rabbanon will explain. But I'm saying that the malacha is the opening the door. Your motive is not that you want to open the door. You want to be able to get in. So there, according to many poskim, you can also separate the two in such a way that the remez would be allowed. And this is a shaila that I had many years ago, that someone was going to visit someone in an old age home where they're very careful that the patients shouldn't walk off. So everything is locked. So the only way you get in is you have to ring the bell or knock. And on Shabbos, if you knock and they buzz you in, so essentially they're doing a malacha for you. But according to the explanation, we said that the malacha is the buzzing the door, and the hana is the coming in, so we can separate the two, and with remez, one would be allowed to do so. So that's as far as if the guy is opening the door for you. Now the question is, what if, you can't wait for the guy to open the door? Because if you have to start waiting every time that you want to go from one word to the other, that someone should open the door for you, that can get quite frustrating. And the concern is that if a doctor gets frustrated with the way he has to behave on Shabbos, there is a chashash that, he may do things that are worse. So we have to try to sort of mitigate the isser, and this way, if that's a comfort level. In other words, we want to try to find a comfort level for the doctor that, this works for him, even though in the weekday he would do it differently. But if this works for him, then, let's try to do it that way. So let's try to understand what exactly is the problem about a person going through an electric door. So according to most poskim, going through an electric door is only an issa d'Rabbanan. So if it's only an issa d'Rabbanan, so we have one, it's one down. Now we have a very interesting halacha, which is obviously a big machlokes, but the poskim say that in dire circumstances, one can rely on it. And that is as follows. We know that there's a concept of shvus de shvus, which means that you can do two d'Rabbanans if it's a tzarech mitzvah or tzarech choili or tzarech gadol, hefsed. In other words, if it's a dire circumstance, you can do a shvus de shvus. What's a shvus de shvus that we find in the Shulchan Aruch and Siman Shin Zayin? That is the inyan of issa d'Rabbanan with a goy, because anytime a goy does something for a yid, it's only issa d'Rabbanan. And if it's a issa d'Rabbanan to begin with, so you have a shvus de shvus. What would be if you have a different setup of two d'Rabbanans, a different setup of shvus de shvus? Let's say, for example, you have a issa d'Rabbanan done al yedei shinui, right? So you have a shinui and you have issa d'Rabbanan. So there we find the big machlokes. The Pri Megadim seems to say that it's a problem, but the Mogen Avraham himself and the Mishnah Berurah in some places seem to say that if it's a tzarech gadol, you can rely on a shvus de shvus, even if it's al yedei Yisrael, a yid is doing it, but it's done with a shinui, and it's issa d'Rabbanan. So you have issa d'Rabbanan, and instead of the goy doing it, it's the yid doing it al yedei shinui. So if that's the case, if we can find a way that usually the way a person would go through from one word to the other is by showing his badge, showing his the thing that he has, and that would sort of buzz him in to the other thing. So if we can do it with an oifen that it's only a issa d'Rabbanan, so because the actual thing is a issa d'Rabbanan, and what you're doing is al yedei shinui, one would be able to be soymech on this shitta in such a circumstance, and would be allowed to move from ward to ward in such a manner. So I think that this can be worked out, that a doctor shouldn't have to wait, until a goy comes or until someone else is passing through, and you do it with your ID card, which has the code to let you in. But if you do it al yidei shinui, whether it's if you have to, let's say, present it, put it by the reader, you do it al yidei shinui. So that's one derabanan, and the actual thing is a derabanan itself. So you have two derabbanans. Or if you can just activate it by wearing it, so you wear it in a different place where you would wear it in the weekday. This way you have an inyan of a shinui and issa derabanan, and that would something that would be allowed. And I think that doing that can work better than telling a doctor to constantly wait for a goy, etc., etc.
Can I just clarify with regards to
Yes.
the shinui? So this is the card that you normally have to touch against. So how would one do it if you can't do it like this?
So let's say you would do it like this. In other words, the way you would present it normally, you do it in a different way. Like, let's say normally you would do it like this, right? You hold it with your two fingers. Yeah. So you hold it with your knuckles. Or you do it in such a way that it would be a shinui, and once you have a shinui, you have one derabanan, and then the fact that this whole action is an inyan of derabanan, so that's another inyan.
Or wear it around the neck, like you said, and just press yourself against.
That's another option if that works. But obviously, sometimes if it's higher, lower. But even that, you can adjust it in such a way that you do it differently than you would do in the weekday, and this way, usually in the weekday you wear it on one
of these things. It's called what?
Extractable. It's an extractable thing, and the reason they have it is because sometimes it's higher, sometimes it's lower. So this way you just present it. But on Shabbos.
Sorry, and this is when you're called routinely, when you're routinely walking about. Obviously, if you call to an emergency,
obviously, yeah, I'll explain that as well. Here I'm talking. You see, the point of tonight's shir is to establish. In other words, this is something that I understood from a doctor, that he says, if I am told that every time I have to go through a ward, I have to wait for a goy, it's going to derail me completely, because sooner or later, or sooner rather than later, I'm going to become frustrated and it's not going to work. So because of that, I thought about it, and I came up with this thing that in such a way, in such a case, you set it up as a trade rabbanon, and by trade rabbanon you can rely on it, obviously in these circumstances, and you can do it that way, and that sort of creates a comfort zone. The point is that a doctor should have a certain comfort zone that works. It may not be as, there's still a shinui involved, but that's something that they can live with, because it's not the end of the world, and this is something which I feel is extremely important. Now, Rebbe Elisha mentioned about when they have to run, they're being called. Let's try to review quickly what we spoke about last time. Last time we explained the whole concept of Ava, which means that the heter of why a doctor can be in hospital is, first of all, it's their shift, okay, but there are Yidden there that they may save a life. Someone came over to me recently, after the last year, and told me a story about a doctor that happened to be in hospital, and he saved the life of another Yid because he was there. So right there you have one heter. Now, obviously, when it comes to these type of things, we're not going to say that every person should wear a phone, and because maybe someone is going to call him and he might save a life. we don't find such a concept bichlal. But here we're talking about a doctor that has a shift, and his shift is on Shabbos, and he couldn't change the shift, right? This is part of what we spoke about last time. So in such a case, the doctor is there because he has a heter of Ava, which means that besides the fact that maybe he can save a Jewish life, but also, as we said, you can't just come out and say no Jewish doctors on Shabbos, because that doesn't work. So, and no Jewish doctors at all is also not an option. So therefore, the heter is Mishum Eva, and Mishum Eva, there is a heter, if it's the Rabbanon, it's L'kul Alma Mutter. That's the Gemara, that's the Tosfos in Masech Avodah Zarah. The challenge that we raised last time, was that how do we deal with the Isura D'Oraisa that a doctor has to do because of Eva? Because if you look in Tosfos, Tosfos is only matir the Isura D'Rabbanan, and the Mishnah Berurah we quoted is very upset at those doctors that are over an Isura D'Oraisa. So we explained that we find in later Achronim who argue on the Mishnah Berurah, Moshe Feinstein and the Klosterberger Rebbe, who says that it doesn't work that way. There is Eva, and if the Eva includes that you have to do Isura D'Oraisa, so that's what you should do. So a doctor that's being called, so first of all, it's only an Isura D'Rabbanan, which means even if you use your card like you would use it regularly, it's only an Isura D'Rabbanan. So Mishum Eva, you're allowed. So the whole question here is setting it up, as part of the shift of what he's doing, how he should do it. And this is what we're trying to explain, that Ba'etzem, moving around in the hospital from ward to ward and needing to use the card, if you do it with a shinui and you also have the whole in Yesed Rabbanon, then you can do so. So that is as far as this aspect. Then there's another aspect, which is something that some doctors ask, and that is, if let's say a doctor is going to hospital for his shift, so what is he allowed to take with him, to hospital on Shabbos? Now, we're talking in a case where there's no Erev, and that means that even if there's an Erev when he goes into the taxi, but when he exits the taxi, he will have to carry whatever he's carrying. So this is a very broad sugya and a very beautiful sugya, which is called ribui b'sheurim, which means that there's a concept of a person adding things to something that he's doing anyway. Now, without going into all the details, it's literally a sugya, for Shabbos Hagadol or for Shabbos Shuva. There's many Mar Mekoimus. It's a deep sugya, but basically, Ribu B'Shiurim has many different manifestations. Let's take, for example, a case in the Gemara. So the Gemara speaks about if you have a choila that needs to eat groigris, which is figs, and you need to cut it. There's no figs to be gotten, so you have to go to a tree and you have to cut off. So you have an option of cutting off a small, a twig that has 2 figs on it, and you have an option of doing the same thing with 3 figs on it. So that is the Gemara calls Ribu B'Shiurim, which is a big chiddush, because essentially, what are you doing? You are doing one Maisa Ketzira, right? Because you're doing one snip, but by doing the twig that has 3, you have 3, and here you have only 2. So that's called Ribu B'Shiurim. Now, there's other manifestations of Ribu B'Shiurim, one of them being Hoitzah, because a person carries, so you're doing Maisa Hoitzah, but everything that you add in that bag is, in addition to the inyan of Hoitzah. Now, without going into all the details and the whole sugya, maybe Alicia will arrange a Yom Iyun one day, but basically, it's a big machloikis rishonim whether Ribi B'Shiurim is midaraisa or whether it's midarabonon. And we see that the poskim are soimach on the Rashba, who holds that it's only a derabanan in dire circumstances. So oy bazoi, we would say as follows, that a doctor that needs to take, whether it's food or whatever he needs to take, then he can add things that otherwise he would maybe be able to go without. Now, we have to appreciate that when it comes to ribi b'shiurim, it's only adding things to something that is allowed. In other words, if a person doesn't need anything and whatever he takes is a isser, it's only if you need to take certain things which would, let's say, for example, this shaila comes up by a woman that goes into hospital for Shabbos, right? So she's preparing a bag. Now, in the bag, she obviously has, essentials that she needs, when she's in a matzav of a chodesh sheyesh b'sakona. But besides that, she wants to take, the Mishpacha magazine. She wants to take, something to read. So is that something that's allowed or not? So we find that that's called ribu b'shiurim, because certain things, let's say a water bottle or food or something that a chola would need, that's something that's allowed. Now, if you're adding something to that, you're marba b'shiurim. But if there's nothing in there that's allowed, then you can't call it ribu b'shiurim. So you have to find the same thing. Let's say a doctor, there must be things that he needs to take for his shift, which his shift is allowed because of the Eva. So therefore, he would be allowed to take some things. So now that he adds, whatever he adds, according to what we said, is a Issa D'Rabbanan. And because it's an Issa D'Rabbanan, if he does it al yidei shinui, you can allow it, because again, you have the concept of a shvus d'shvus l'tzoyrech gadol. So this is, more or less the things that we wanted to discuss this evening, and I'm happy to take questions, Be'ez Hashem, and also if there are other such type of scenarios that can be established of how a doctor should sort of set up his practice of what he's going to do in a shift, then that could be very helpful, because that's something that he'll continue doing throughout his career. So, Rebbe Elisha, if you want to field some questions.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Bixenspanner. Just a specific question that was asked, it was messaged to me before. If someone is going to the hospital to give birth, what sort of things they can take with them in their bag?
So there, you have this thing that because there are essentials that they're allowed to take, so anything else would be considered ribi b'shiurim, and ribi b'shiurim will rely that it's a derabanan, and if she does it with a shinui, then it's trade derabanan l'tzorech gadol, which there's a mokum to be matir.
Another question: if someone needs to go from one ward to another, but they have to put in a code which is electronic, would using the knuckles also be considered a shinui?
So that's also an Indian of a shinui, and it's an Issa D'Rabbanan, trade D'Rabbanan.
So one can use the knuckles to do that.
Yeah.
Fine. Thank you very much. We look forward to the next Shiur Be'ezrat Hashem. And I'm sure there'll be other questions that people are going to forward after they listen to it on YouTube as well. Oh, is it a couple? The question just came in now.
Yes.
You can see that. Maybe you want to answer that now.
Yes. So someone is asking about Marasa Ayin, whether there's an in of Marasa Ayin. So there's no Marasa Ayin, because you see, this is a very good question actually, and it's negeya in many aspects of halacha. The Indian of Marasa Ayin is only when there is a mokum to say that a person is doing something wrong. If someone thinks that someone that's in hospital in a robe, in a coat, right? We're talking about someone wearing a white coat, and you think that whatever he's doing in Isser, then the person thinking that way has a problem, because we don't have to be choishish for every meshuganer that will sees everything black and sees everything in a negative way. Maras Ayin, there's many marmakoimis to that in the Rishonim that discuss different aspects of Maras Ayin. That Maras Ayin is only when there's a reasonable circumstance that people might think that he's doing something wrong. But just like we don't find that a woman that's going to have a baby, so you go in a taxi. Now, if someone sees a Jewish person in a taxi, who knows what they may think. But a person should realize that if you see a Yid, that's dressed like a Yid in a taxi on Shabbos, that there's an emergency. There are many stories about that. I saw a story not so long ago about a certain family that it adopted someone that became a Baal Tshuva, he became Frum, and basically they were makar of him, and they gave they really opened their home and hearts for him, and it went on for a long time. One Shabbos they said goodbye, and they looked out of the window, and they see a taxi coming, picking him up, and he leaves in a taxi. They were very, very upset. They said, we're putting in so much effort into this person. We're opening our hearts and homes. We're giving him, so much. It costs us so much money, and here he has a chutzpah of leaving our house in a taxi. He couldn't go a few blocks later and take a taxi from there. They got very, very upset, and they cut off contact. And months went by, and after a few months, they get a phone call from his family that he passed away. They were shocked, and they decided, maybe it's time to reconcile a bit, and they went to pay a shiva call. And they were sitting there, they were talking, and they heard the story. What happened, that he had a condition that he would be able to feel that he's having a heart attack or something. And most of the time when such a thing happened, he was able to get help. And actually, he said a few months ago, he was at your house and he felt the symptoms coming. So he ordered a taxi to go straight to the hospital, and his life was saved. But this time he didn't make it. And that's when they found out that what they thought, that this guy is being Machal Shabbos because he's going straight out of their house into a taxi, was actually an inyan of pikuach nefesh. So a person has to try to judge other people favorably, and the inyan of Maras Ayin is not for people that are just not reasonable at all. Okay, so we have here a question of Hatzalah members that have a bunch of things that. So again, lekatchila, if it's not something that they actually need, they should empty out their pockets, because this is only a heter for, let's say, this is something that is a very, very common shaila about a yoledus, right? A woman in labor. So in her mind, she needs a newspaper, she needs a mobile phone, she needs a bunch of things. Now, the halacha says that, if you don't have a mobile phone, it's not pikuach nefesh. If you don't have a newspaper, it's not pikuach nefesh. So because you have the inyan that, to calm her a bit, so we're going to rely on the heter of ribu b'shiurim, alidei shinoi, with the rashba. But stam to carry it, just for that, for no reason, there's no...
No, but they may need it. The point is they may. When they get...
If they may need it, that's something else.
They may need it.
If there's a chance that they may need it, so we can say yes, because they may need it, and the whole concept. You see, when it came to Hatzalah, and especially when they established Hatzalah in New York, and they went, they worked with Moshe Feinstein and the Gedolei Poskim. The big challenge there was, we're creating a new concept which never existed. In Halacha, we don't find a heter for people to walk around with radios, because maybe they're going to get a call and someone is going to be, life is going to be saved. Lives were saved, yes, many lives were saved, but we don't find that you should be allowed to be Machal Shabbos because maybe a person's life is going to be saved. So the Reb Moshe Feinstein based his psak, which is the tshuva that we quoted last time, where he speaks about the inyan of Hatzalah. He says, because the fact is that these members are called out more than once on a Shabbos, so that is why they can drive back. That's what we spoke about last time, that in some places where they don't have, where the area, the parameter of where Hatzalah covers is literally 50 miles and more, so not always is having a goy practical, so the Yidden do it, and sometimes you see things which you don't understand. Like I said the story last time that I saw, which something that I don't understand. But the point is that because they're called out, so they're allowed to carry radios, because it's a fact. So because these tools is something that they may need, so that would include the same thing. It's no different that when they drive in the car, they have the defibrillator and all kinds of equipment which they don't use every time, but that's part of their the tools that they have. But if it's tam for nothing, then they should empty it out. Okay, any other questions?
I think that's it.
Okay, so if there's any other further questions, you can always send it in to Alicia, to myself, in an email, and we're happy to try to answer. And in the meantime, thanks everyone for listening, and Mitzvah Hashem, we look forward for the next year.
Amen. Thank you very much, Rabbi Sasani.
Okay,
Thank you, everyone. Good night. Kol tov.
Kol tov.